National treasure means old. That's all it means. I love coming to Stanford. I enjoy every day that I'm here. I think it's the 4th or 5th year that I've come for the month of January. And every time I learn something and I enjoy myself, and I actually believe that this year has been the most enjoyable of all of them. So I want to thank Arun. I want to thank everyone else, Sally, she's not here now, for letting me come here, inviting me here. John, I hope from now on you will introduce me if I ask to speak again. Jim Sweeney, it's a great pleasure to see you. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for coming. So I'm going to talk to you about a particular subject. And that subject's right here on the slide. It is near carbon-free electricity generation from renewables and using storage. And uncharacteristically, I have been an optimist. I am an optimist about this. And I believe we are very close to having an economically competitive triad, wind, solar, and storage, to produce electricity at the lowest cost, as low as the cheapest fossil alternative, which is natural gas combined cycle. That is what I'm here to speak to you about. Nobody has given me instructions about this. So here are my 4 points, the 4 points I ask you to take away. That we are close to having this be a commercial operation, that the main uncertainty is the future of storage costs, but just like other renewables who have fallen in cost like a stone, this one is on a path of becoming much cheaper, but I'm going to let you choose what you think the costs of storage are going to be in the future. A key question that one has in producing such generation in this particular hybrid way is to say, what is the availability going to be? Are you going to ask for carbon-free storage 100% of the time that you meet demand, or only 95% of the time that you meet demand? Because meeting that last increment of demand is terribly expensive to do. But here again, I will allow you to make your choice of where you want to do it. And finally, I'm going to propose a different policy for encouraging this technology. That means that I want to find a way to introduce it and have the private sector see what the results are and have them make the investments in the future, which means that I am opposed to mandatory regulation for introducing storage, such as is practiced in this far west corner of the United States, in contrast to looking at another way of encouraging it by doing a demonstration project. Here's the system I'm looking at. Variable renewable energy sources, wind and solar, an energy storage system, ESS. Both of them go with direct current coupling to power control systems, and they meet the load L there. That's the system I'm looking at. And there are these 3 components, wind and solar, the renewable pieces, and storage. And here's how I'm going to look at this problem. I'm going to use this procedure. First, as an example, I'm going to choose one load area. And what I did is I chose a load area as close to my birth date as I could. It turned out to be in the middle of Texas, in the ERCOT service area. I looked at the load, or ERCOT presented me with a load at every day of the year. I think I took the year 2016. I and my colleagues, I should have mentioned my colleagues on the first slide. If you can say Deutch doesn't know anything about storage, but Yet-Ming Chiang certainly does. So I took this, the demand load I'm meeting is at ERCOT for this year, every day of the year, 100% of the time. Then I go to NREL, and I say, what is the sunlight at that point, and how much electricity can I expect from that? And they have both the data of the irradiance And they have a tool which allows you to translate that into kilowatts per meter squared. And in wind, the same thing. They report the data at that point, every hour of every day of the year. And they also provide a simpler tool to tell you how much wind generation there is. They, of course, have the capacity factor built into that data, and we know that wind does not shine all the time. And I'm sorry, wind does shine all the time. Then we perform an optimization, which I'm only going to give you the results of. I'm not going to go into it. And secondly, that we do it for fixed availability, saying what percentage of that load do I want to meet? Here is the answer on this one chart. And I will spend a few moments going over it. On the base is the cost of the total cost of the energy system measured in dollars per kilowatt hour. On the y-axis is the power of that storage system measured in dollars per kilowatt. Now, we know where some of those storage technologies are on that chart today, and we have estimates of where they'll be on the future, but I allow you and your investment advisors to say where they're going to be a few years from now. You could choose where it's going to be. And I should say and underscore heavily that the storage system here, I'm agnostic with respect to technology for storage. But we are looking at such areas as using more hydro storage, pumped and conventional hydrodynamic storage. We are looking at compressed air storage. And of course, we're looking at an array of battery types. And for the sake of illustration, I use here both lithium-ion batteries and flow batteries. And I mark there with an X in these two variables that characterize their cost, power and energy. I mark with an X the present cost of lithium-ion batteries, the proposed projected future cost, and I compare it to flow battery costs. On the chart, the result of the optimization tells you the combinations in terms of the least cost combinations, which will meet that fixed load at that point in the ERCOT service area. So if you look at the curves, they are measured here in dollars per megawatt hour. So they go from lithium ion today, if you have to use that. Boy, well, is this ever going to be you'd be paying $130 per megawatt hour, or 13 cents per kilowatt hour, quite a high price at generation. But if you look all the way in the future, you can see that at the flow battery proposed future cost in the two-dimensional choice that you have, you would be doing $60 per megawatt hour, 6 cents per kilowatt hour, which is what we are told by those reliable people in New York. Now I've lost the name of the bank, which says, what's that? You see, this is why you can't trust. You just can't trust people here. So they know the names of banks. I don't know the names of banks. So in any event, there it's $60 per megawatt hour, 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And there you see the compressed natural gas price falls right on top of it. So future batteries would make it, if you believe that number of the cost of the storage. When wind and solar together exceed $45 per megawatt hour, you are always going to be above the compressed natural gas price of today. That's why it lies outside this curve. So that is about it for this chart. It's at 100% availability, no price escalation, and you can choose your storage in these two parameters. If you choose pumped hydro, you have an entirely different point on this chart or region than if you choose batteries or if you choose compressed air. Okay. Now, the least cost of meeting that load depends upon the effective availability factor that you have chosen to adopt. If you want to choose 100% meeting that load, then you are all the way up at the highest cost point. 100% at the highest. 100%. If you're the effective availability factor at 100% is way up there. At 99% for two different kinds of storage, I just chose lithium-ion future or flow battery futures, you would then have this mix of storage parameters, but your price, as you can see here, is at the level of very high costs here. $100 per megawatt hour, 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Is that right? Right. But if you bring it down to 95% availability, that is, you give up 5% of the time, you will be choosing another generating technology, one that produces CO2, like natural gas combined cycle. You drop that cost almost by 50%, depending upon, again, the storage technology that you're using. So you have to say to yourself, is it really true that with this device, this system, this hybrid system, I want to reach to 100%, or will I be satisfied with 95%? And you see here the great benefit that you get by dropping your availability from 100 to 95%. This is the way the curve shifts. And when you look at the calculation with 95%, exactly the same optimization as before, you see that now lithium-ion of the future is exactly the same, or roughly the same, as a combined cycle natural gas with a $30 per metric ton carbon charge. If you look at the flow of the future, you're even in better shape. You're equivalent to the cost of compressed natural gas generation without any carbon charge. So you are in the ballgame, very much so in the ballgame, just by giving up that 5%. It's really quite impressive. And it may even be true. Well, what do I do if I'm 5% short on load? I have to find a way to claw back the load. And the first thing I can do is I can go to the consumers, whether they're commercial or individuals, and say, look, don't use any electricity for this brief period of time when this will happen, and we'll pay you money for that. So there's a demand response to this sharp availability drop. That's one way I can do it. Another thing I can do is, if I didn't live in the United States, I could build more transmission lines to get more places, origins of generation to the place where I have a shortfall. Of course, that means not only you have to cover that expense, but you also have to deal with the regulatory burdens of getting more transmission. Or the third thing I could do is I could make a deal with a utility or an electricity service provider some distance away that they will agree to have a kind of an insurance pool that they'll provide me. Or the last thing I can do is I can actually burn some combined cycle natural gas generation and produce CO2. Even there, I urge you to be calm, because Sally is going to figure out a way, and is going to propose a way, to use carbon capture and sequestration for that small sliver of generation to get rid of that. My point is there are many different ways of dealing with the advantage of having only 95% availability rather than 100% of availability. Going for 100% is always a mistake in the world of economics. There are other mistakes about the world of economics, but I'm not going to share them with you right now. This is the way you measure availability. The green curve here represents, for the hybrid system that I look as my candidate mix of renewables and storage, is how it goes along with time, how it goes up and down, depending upon how the wind and the solar, the time of day, and everything else. And the blue line is the fixed load. And if you look here in the corner, you see that there's sometimes when I have net generation plus storage, delivery to storage, over the load, and that you just waste. You just throw that away. But there are other times when the load is above the net generation. And there I'm not meeting load, and I have to curtail load through one of the ways that I mentioned to you. For those of you who don't believe that I can do an optimization calculation of this type, I have collaborators who can. What are the results? The main results that I want to share with you today is that the first one is what I said. You are going to find yourself very shortly in a situation where you have storage alternatives when matched with existing solar and wind generating systems will be able to meet load extremely effectively. As I said, if dropping to 5% of load cuts the costs by 50% of meeting the load. What happens with respect to different shifts, if renewables become less of a contributor, as of course storage costs go down, optimally it turns out the amount of wind and solar is about the same at this point in ERCOT because of the capacity factors of these two renewable generating technologies. So all of these things can, and if storage gets much cheaper, or if you happen to use very inexpensive and available water, pumped hydro storage, you can get a lot of different, you have a lot of dependence on that storage technology, and you have therefore a larger number of hours per day that are used of that technology. What about uncertainty? We chose just 1 year, and we looked at that 1 year and said, this is the optimal solution. But in fact, there is intermittency. And intermittency exists for a fixed load factor. What happens is you can have 10 days of absent dark sun at one time, or you can have the 10 days distributed over a longer period of time. If the time when you have to make up for poor sunlight or poor wind is distributed across the time period, it's easier to have a storage system meet it. If they get bunched together, then you have an intermittency, which is going to be a very, very demanding constraint on the system. So you have to ask yourself, what are the results of uncertainty in this system? That is, if you consider uncertain demand, how are you going to deal with this problem? I hope that's on the next slide. It isn't on. Yes, it is. Here it is. So what you see is under this case, I have to do a slightly more complicated optimization program, which takes into account the minimization of the cost times the demand quantity at day by day in the characteristic year I'm looking at. I have to do a different minimization. And how do I do that? You do that by one of two ways. I looked at 1 year. Did I say 2016? You'd have to look at 15 different years. And if you look at 15 different years, the intermittency will begin to show itself up and average out between the large number of repetitive time periods that you choose. So you have to have a long sequence of stable data, which are beginning to collect now in all the utilities, at least in the United States, certainly in ERCOT. Or the alternative way to do it is to try and describe those intermittent times when the sun goes away or the wind ceases to blow by building a Markov transition matrix, probability theory, probability description of the specific year you're looking at with different transition probabilities. What if it's dark one day? What is the likelihood it'll be dark the second day? And for that, you need to do the Markov description, and you also have to justify it by making sure that it agrees with the data in the year that you're looking at. If the system were ergodic, both those two results would have to be identical as a way of dealing with uncertainty. But the system is certainly not ergodic. So you've got to be careful. You've got to be careful about how you do this. But you do have to look at uncertainty. You just can't go rushing into this without considering the uncertainty now, not in the sense of capacity factor, but the uncertainty with respect to intermittency, the sequence of events that can be unfavorable to you for more than one period. And I'm told that the worst that it gets in California is 10 days. 10 days of really sharp sequential. That may happen to you once a year. So, okay, what do I want to do? I have a new proposal about how to encourage this technology pathway. I don't want to do it by somebody in Boston or in California saying there's a mandatory amount of storage that you have to put in your system today. Because for two reasons. The first is there's no apparent, or even to my mind, nobody knows how they connect that requirement of how much storage has to be put in with respect to the actual economics of the system that is operating. And secondly, when you do something like that, the private sector has difficulty in seeing through that to how much the actual costs were for this additional social benefit of avoiding CO2 emissions. So is there a better way of doing it? And I claim, yes, there is a better way of doing it. The better way of doing it is to allow there to be a competition between a set of energy developers who will make a deal with a utility system, whether it's one or several particular grids is their question to design, come back in and say, we are willing to undertake a 20-year time period where we will provide electricity either by storage, our choice of what we use, or by wind and solar, our choice of how much of each. And we are willing to do this for so many cents per kilowatt hour throughout that 20-year period. There surely will be escalators in there, but they're escalators which are tied to other kinds of indicators that you would want to see in a fair system. And then from that, you say the government will assure that the regulatory envelope is there to protect that particular federally sponsored experiment from being done, and with its results revealed to the private sector to encourage their use of it, deployment in other areas. Certain places jump into mind as where you might want to try where an energy developer might look. An energy developer might look at, let's say, Puerto Rico, or an energy developer would certainly want to look at Hawaii. And indeed, Hawaii has recently announced an interesting regulatory pushed effort which says in Hawaii we are going to bid out 250 megawatts of renewable energies and storage for the lowest price. And from that, we will try and see how it works in the Hawaiian framework, which of course has a much higher cost of electricity at the wholesale level than many other parts of the country, most other parts of the country. I think that the average cost of generation, wholesale generation in Hawaii is about 10 cents, and the bid that came in for this was about 6 cents. Now, inside that bid are a lot of existing subsidies, so it doesn't really correspond to the pristine MIT-designed experiment that I would do, but it is a mark of the system looking now for more transparent efforts to prove this technology. So I close with the following comment. Wind plus solar plus storage is going to be here, and it's going to be here soon. And the job now is to decide how you are going to make progress on that, how you're going to get the private sector to deploy that in the shortest period of time. Now, of course, there's not only one country here of interest. There are other countries as well. And the way that this kind of mix, both its scale and its actual mix of the different components to this hybrid electric system would work, would be quite different. So indeed, it might work very effectively in those countries where availability is not at 100%, availability is near the level of 0%. So that you're very much more on the more favorable part of the curve of providing electricity in many different parts of the world. My point here is a great opportunity. It's a great achievement of industry in the United States, government supporting R&D, but it's something that deserves our attention today, unlike other forms of electricity generation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
From the audience here. Let's start with the students. I see one there, Patricia.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. It's really interesting to see your analysis. So I noticed that you did your simulation in Texas, which is known for having a availability of renewable energy, especially wind and solar, that's very complementary in a way that isn't replicated in most parts of the country, let alone the world. So I'm wondering if you have or have plans to do a similar analysis for other locations which may have less favorable renewables, and if you have a sense for the order of magnitude effect that would have on your result.
So the answer is I chose Texas as my single example because I'm a man of the people. I'm not a fancy person from Massachusetts or, yeah. So, but the answer is, in fact, similar calculations have been done for two other states. One is Illinois, and the other, I'm sorry, not Illinois, Iowa, and the other is, in fact, Massachusetts. Needless to say, Iowa beats the system in terms of least cost of meeting load, the fixed level of load, and Massachusetts does worse. But the answer is, of course, you should, and a careful person would do a thorough job. I'm not either careful or thorough. But the numbers will come out very, very, I mean, they're not that far apart.
So two more student questions, then I want to come back here because we had an immediate question in the back there. Say on the aisle.
Yeah, hi, thanks. A really interesting presentation, but I'm surprised by your you're saying that you're not for any type of regulation, you're for a federally sponsored demonstration project. To me, that seems like a pretty weak proposal given where we're at. I mean, and like you said, there's been states, there's been other projects around the world. You're showing how it can work. That's one more project to show how it works, to my mind, doesn't change the trajectory we're on. So I would ask you, is that really all you're proposing? Is this?
Well, first of all, when I said I really was speaking to federal protection from intervening regulation, not using dollars. But I want to say to you, better times will come in Washington, D.C. than currently are present. And secondly, I will say this. What I meant about the states is the regulatory mandate. What I don't think is proper about the California system is not that they're putting money into something, but that the way they're doing it is by saying, you utilities have to buy, I think it's 1.8 gigawatts of storage in a specified period of time. And a private investor can't learn anything from that. So it's not so much that it's a state, it's the use of a regulatory mandate of introducing storage without any reference to an actual load completion activity.
Okay.
Sure, please.
I still, even so, if you do your preferred experiment where this really does show the financial results.
Or better shows, better.
Okay. To me, to my mind, that still doesn't change. You know, there's so much inertia and special interest that I don't see that changing things.
Well, things do change. I mean, this is not, now you're not arguing about the state versus federal, you just say things are slow everywhere.
No, I'm saying that, well, I'm just surprised that that's your take.
Look, sorry, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be defensive.
No.
What would you propose?
It's probably pie in the sky, but a lot of people talk about a carbon tax. They say that's the cleanest, right?
Oh, count me in. Count me in. In fact, I'm for a carbon tax that is totally recycled to the consumer. Count me in. This would just help. I mean, that would not. This is not a competitor. That's much more important than this mild effect on improving electricity generation emissions. But remember, carbon tax in Bangladesh is less likely than here, as low likely as it is here now.
Great. Let's do these two here. I lied, John, and behind John.
Hi. Thanks again. I think so your proposal around incentivizing a project for hybrid energy system like this is based around price discovery for how much this would cost, the combined solar and storage and wind system. How does the price discovery in that context differ substantially from the price discovery we get already from utilities going out and procuring independent wind contracts, solar contracts, and storage contracts independently?
Well, because many of those purchases are caused by regulatory mandates, renewable energy standards. They are also have dispatch rules that are based on the regulatory preferences for wind over, let's say, nuclear, because of the results of subsidies on generation of wind. So it's only a question that it takes it out, hopefully, in a meaningful degree from regulatory and subsidy masking of the underlying economics.
Okay, straight back from John, then we're going to come out here.
Hi, thanks so much. So in your proposal, you were saying that something like a 20-year demonstration for this would be the way to go, but to stop warming of 1.5 degrees, we need to reduce our carbon on a much shorter time scale than 20 years. So do you have any ideas for how you might expedite something like this so that it doesn't take such a long time to demonstrate?
We'd have to meet in a smaller group, but the answer is I do. You won't like them, but I do. I think that it's an urgent question for all universities to be talking about, saying, look, we're not making progress. Paris is not progress at the level you need. So we have to be thinking about changing the global attitude towards climate policy. No more wine and brie meetings every year at the Conference of the Parties or every other year. We have to really get serious about adopting different approaches. That is not the topic of this discussion. But I don't claim that this doesn't hit anything but the third or fourth decimal place on a trajectory which is absolutely catastrophic.
Okay, I think you were first, and then we'll pick up a few up here. Yes, sir.
Thank you for that talk. I'm just trying to understand exactly what your competitive proposal is. So utilization factor for solar activity is less than 20%. If you combine it with wind, maybe you can double or slightly more than that. So are you proposing 300 megawatts during the time that we have peak power?
Peak power.
But that's a very different story than when they talk about 95% of the time I have the hybrid system and only 5% I'm not doing hybrid. Because if you were to do this 24 hours a day, your system is going to be probably more expensive than just doing it on a peak power basis. But LCOE is probably the more likely comparison, which would make that a very expensive proposition.
First of all, the problem that is posed in the real world is you have a community which depends upon electricity, and that demand rises and falls just on the demand side, on the load side. And the calculation here is I don't push back on the shape of that load curve. I take it as being fixed, and then that's why I talked about uncertainty in it. But the answer is this is the least cost way of beating it with those three ingredients. And I've compared it to the closest I know competitor for that for meeting the load 95 or 100% of the time, which is combined cycle natural gas. These are the numbers. And I mean, I'm quite certain about.
Now we're going to go over here, down here, and back.
Hi. Can you say what the result will be if you use 1 cent per kilowatt hour for storage, $100 per kilowatt hour capacity, and 10,000 cycles? What would that give you as a cost per megawatt hour for 100% availability, roughly speaking?
I don't know.
It'd be at 2 cents a kilowatt hour for solar. It'd be around 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour.
I don't know.
Those batteries are coming. I can tell you.
Oh, if those batteries are coming, you're just making. I mean, you're going to tell me I'm going to even be a better, bigger success. Right. That's fine. Yes, sir.
Then all then back, and then over and back up here.
I'd like to know if you've seen this 270, some of that page report from MIT.
Likely I have.
That says nuclear is essential. And I'd like to say I just agree with your overall analysis, and I'll talk to you later about it. But the problem is that everyone here should understand is you've ignored all the environmental and pollution effects of wind and solar.
I have not taken into account. I have not. You're right. I have not. But let me say a word about nuclear power. I'm probably the only person in this room who lived at a time and was in the Department of Energy at a time when we were building 6 nuclear plants a year by 4 competitive reactor designers. And I want to tell you, there is nobody who is more pro-nuclear than I am. However, when we look in detail, Arup and I, others, at the prospects for nuclear, they are so serious, including at MIT. What's that?
Not in this paper.
You know, it is. Regrettably, it's a free university. I can't control. But
I'm as old as you are. I'm just saying.
I don't think so. But I want to say something. There's something else. That I think they're saying it's only when you get down to 95% availability that nuclear is cheaper. And nuclear is not even in the game until you get there. But they're correct about that calculation. They don't look at storage very closely. Okay.
Nuclear is storage.
Yes. Yes.
Fission reactors are storage.
Yes.
And California regularly asks the Diablo Canyon plant to run beyond its refueling
Right.
cycle so that we can service the air conditioning load in Southern California this summer.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the fact that you've ignored other sources that are clean and have ignored the pollution of the sources that are intermittent is, I think, an important defect.
You got a public comment?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Thank you for your presentation. I want to thank you especially for including the carbon tax in your analysis that Secretary Schultz and others have proposed. And I really like what you said about learning. I think there's another issue here about learning which is really important, not so much for private expenditures, but also for public expenditures. And the $30 a ton, I'm sure you've got a good reason for that, but that's not the only choice that a regulator or or body politic could make about how to price carbon. So I'm curious whether you've done any kind of sensitivity analysis on that question.
No, I just took 30 because.
Do you think it's worth doing? Because that might
there is a lot of work done.
Well, the specific question I have is, if you were to do that kind of sensitivity analysis, would it tell us what the carbon tax has to be so that we could get to price parity in today or in a year future?
Well, I would tell you that I would favor any carbon tax that could pass. That's my first point. But my second point is I think the $30 number is taken out of one of the central possibilities of the White House-run social cost of carbon analysis. So it's consistent with that, but I don't believe that that's high-energy physics. That's just economists. Yeah. So, but I'll tell you, we have certainly not done anything here. We just chose that number as representative, and that's.
I got on the National Academy Review with that with both economists and physicists. I agree with you on both counts.
There already are many wind farms in operation or in design phases around the world.
Yes.
Over there, they have half, roughly, of your hybrid plant already.
Yes.
In other words, minus the battery packs.
Yes.
So can't you do something simpler, more straightforward, with a huge amount of
Yes.
operational data available already on wind?
Yes. I'd have to claw back their federal subsidies, though.
Yeah. So why can't we do that?
I would have to claw back their federal subsidies. Their whole project basis is based on, 1.3 cents per kilowatt hour now? And more when they were built. But I wouldn't mind cleverer ways of running an experiment. I just want to see somebody say, yes, a developer, say, yes, I'm willing to try and put together a project that in this particular locale makes sense with a combination of wind, solar, and storage. You can choose the kind of storage you think is best.
So John Bashy, and I want to go in the back if there are any residual questions.
Yeah, so I have a question about sort of federal versus state, and this comes from the experience 40 years ago at Bell Labs, where we, of course, did all kinds of analysis of busy hours of Mother's Day and all that stuff, and the local PUCs looked at the service level metrics like crazy and beat on us if we didn't do well enough. So what my question is talk about the balance between doing it federally versus aligning with the PUCs in the states. What's the trade-off there? I mean, it seems in many cases getting it to happen quicker would be finding PUCs that are really interested in seeing if you work with them.
I'm a federal man.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
Okay, ma'am.
And in your proposal that you mentioned is the island is kind of the beneficial to produce the energy. And,
I can't hear you, dear.
Is in your proposal that you mentioned Hawaii and Puerto Rico is the kind of island to produce the energy. And I'm thinking after the disaster of the Japan and nuclear, and I wonder there is a possibility in Japan to have the kind of because the Japan has the long coastline, and the lot of possibility to have a business smaller.
I don't know the circumstances in Japan today. I just don't. I would guess that they would have to rely a lot on offshore wind, which will change the costs quite considerably. But this is not a proposal that is designed for California or any other particular place. If it's going to work here, it'll work in other places as well.
Yeah, we do have an executive from TEPCO in Japan coming here at the end of the quarter to talk, so you should come and ask that question. If you're not here, I'll ask it for you. Maybe one or two more. Any other questions? Oh, sir.
This is more, maybe a little smaller there. What would you think to get more people to look into this at the private end, at having a tariff on electricity which essentially separates out where you can purchase on a minute-by-minute basis at spot, rather than saying a tariff that is fixed noon to 9, that type of thing?
I think that, and here again, we're getting a little bit outside my lane, but my view is that the intermediation between the consumer and the electric utility company, which wants to set a set tariff on the number of kilowatt hours you use, is vanishing. And you're coming to a position where you're going to have households, and certainly industrial and commercial operations, negotiating on a minute-by-minute basis, maybe through an intermediary, with what price they're willing to bid for how much electricity. So I think the world is going that way, the way you're mentioning.
I mentioned on that I happen to have a Tesla Powerwall, and that's what I would love to be able to do, but I'm fixed to tariffs, which are...
It's the state you're in.
Yeah.
With that said, I'd like to say, much to my surprise, Arun was right, and John really is a national treasure, as you've just seen. So let's thank him on that.